This is Join Us in France, episode 29. Hello, I'm Annie.
And I'm Elise.
And we welcome you to the Join Us in France travel podcast. Elise is a professional tour guide, art historian, and a really good storyteller.
Yeah.
The theme of today's show is Covered Passages in Paris. And it's a little bit mysterious to me, and I'm not really sure where Elise is going to take this, so I'm not even going to try to introduce the subject.
Oh my God, you're not.
So you don't have to fear that I'm going to spoil any surprises, Elise. You're safe this time.
This is it. I'm on my own.
You're on your own.
Oh,
I got
boy.
nothing to say about this.
She's got nothing to say about it.
So instead, I'll go straight into thanking listeners for iTunes reviews. So the first listener we want to say thank you to is Upanitso from the United States of America.
Upanitso.
Says, love it, can't keep it down. I'm so glad I found your podcast. I listen every day while driving to work. I can't keep it down. Your podcasts are very informative and detail-oriented. Loved your episodes on Notre Dame and Sainte-Chapelle. My family and I will be traveling to Paris this fall, and I will definitely put in practice all the wonderful tips that I've learned while listening to both of you. She says thank you, and we say thank you to you, too.
And thank you to you, too.
Yeah.
And let us know when you go what you think of what you
Yeah.
have seen.
Yeah, we'd love to hear more about how your visit goes. And Bonnie D in Central VA, that's Virginia, right?
Virginia.
Yeah, says, now I know how I messed up, she says. She also gives us a 5-star review. I just listened to our French People Rude episode, which was, I think, episode 9, and discovered why I had been soundly ignored in shops in Paris 30 years ago.
Ah.
I had no idea I needed to say bonjour. I'm learning so much about French customs that you just don't learn in school or in language programs.
You have to go back now, and now that you know all this.
That's right. Go back and test them again.
Right.
We are very gratified that you took the time to write us a review in iTunes. And let me continue to encourage listeners to do so because it really helps people find the show. And, as you know, anything you can do to help others find the show is wonderful. It really helps us. If you're not sure where to go to write a review, you can always go to the joinusfrance.com website and click on the right-hand side. There's a subscribe to the podcast in iTunes, or that's a black button, or hear us on Stitcher Radio. And if you click on those, it'll take you right to where you need to leave your review. So it makes it easy for you.
For people like you.
Oh, it's easy for anybody. It does take some time, so, you know. And also, I wanted to say thank you to Jan, I think it's Hawks, from Australia.
Wow.
She circled us on Google Plus a few shows back. I was complaining I was so lonely on Google Plus.
Uh-huh.
I immediately got 4 or 5 new subscribers. She's the only one whose name I wrote down. And this morning I haven't had time to go back and look. So thank you, you guys. You are wonderful. It's really nice to not be so lonely on Google Plus.
And Annie does not like to be lonely.
No, I don't like to be lonely. So here you go, a little music to get us in the mood, and then we'll talk about Paris Covered Passageways. Okay, Elise, so what do you mean by covered passageways?
Okay, so in fact, the name for these places in French is des passages couverts,
Okay,
but sometimes they're also called galleries.
okay.
All right. Now, it's interesting because I didn't know about these for quite a while in all my visits and even the time that I was actually living for a while in Paris. And it was really thanks to one of my Parisian friends that I first found out about them. It's very interesting to know that Parisians all know about them and that it's something that they consider to be an intricate and essential part of life in Paris, and much more so than some of the things that, of course, tourists head for right away, things we've already talked about.
Right.
So I went on a kind of a discovery trip.
Cool.
And I haven't seen every single one of them. But I went and visited a whole bunch of them, and lo and behold, they are absolutely fascinating. So I thought it would be a really nice thing to talk about, because if you're interested in being in Paris and seeing something that isn't on the what might be called the A-list of things you do the first time around, this is something that's a wonderful thing to do. And it is a truly Parisian thing to visit.
Right. It's great because it's off the beaten track.
It's a little bit off the beaten track because most tourists do not go to them unless they're taken by the hand and taken there, like I was, by somebody. And I certainly don't consider myself to be really a tourist in Paris. So let's just talk a little bit about what they are. They are passageways that are basically private property, and in these passageways, and we'll talk about where they are and a little bit of the history of them, in these passageways, there are always shops. There are always stores, sometimes restaurants. In the case of a few of them, in a particular area, there were theaters.
Okay.
And basically what they are the absolute first ancestor of what we would now call a shopping mall.
Oh, yeah.
It was started in the 1700s.
Oh, wow.
Which is a long time ago, considering. They were actually conceived of in the middle of the 1700s by various entrepreneurial types. This is, of course, pre-revolution. This is Paris, when Paris was part of what we now, of course, know of Paris. It was the old city center. But it was conceived of as something for the upper middle classes and for the rich. Now, I have no name to give anybody about who the first person was to come up with this idea. The very first ones that were constructed were constructed probably in the 1760s and 1770s. But believe it or not, the oldest one still standing is from 1799.
That's a long time ago.
And it is called the Passage Panorama.
Panorama.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about the two major neighborhoods in Paris where you can still find them. All of them, except for maybe one or two that are not even mentioned in most of the books, are on the right side, the right bank of Paris. That is the north side of the Seine. There are two main areas where they still exist, where you can visit them, you can walk through them, you can, in some cases, not just go window shopping or go into the shops, but you can actually go into a few of them and have a lovely tea or have a lovely meal. There are all kinds of shops, and I'll talk about the specialties of some of these different places.
Yeah.
The first group were actually built around the area of the Palais Royal.
Okay.
And the Palais Royal is, it's very interesting because we have to back up a teeny little bit in history. The Palais Royal is an enormous park or square, if you want, with galleries around it and apartments and shops around it that is 2 blocks behind the Louvre.
Okay.
So it's really very close to the Louvre area. And that was, for a very long time, the home of a man we've mentioned in some of our histories and talking about various kings, and that was the Cardinal Richelieu.
Yeah, okay.
He was, the equivalent of a prime minister who was all-powerful, and he had himself built an enormous, enormous palace that had grounds on it that were like a park. And this is in the end of the 1600s. Okay?
Right.
He had this built behind the Louvre because he was working with the king and the queen. And he was just what now we would call a few blocks away. He had this huge piece of land. He was extremely wealthy. And he made this magnificent palace for himself. And he bought this huge piece of land attached to it. and he created a park so that in his idle moments, which I don't think he had too many of, but actually in his idle moments, he could look out on this magnificent park. Now, after he died and after the court moved out of Paris and to Versailles, which is, of course, under Louis XIV, what happened was this land was taken over by one of the dukes who was one of the brothers of the king.
Okay.
And the name got changed to the royal place.
Okay.
Because
Palais
Richelieu was dead.
Royal.
Right?
Yeah.
And then what happened was that it stayed in the hands of various members of the royal family
Right.
for, let's say, about 70, 80 years.
Okay.
And along came a man who was Duc de Chartres. He was, in fact, one of the brothers of the King Louis XVI. So we're talking about the 1770s, the 1780s, up to the French Revolution. And his name was Philippe. His name was Philippe d'Orléans. That was his official name.
I've heard that name.
He was the Duke of Chartres. And once the revolution started, he decided, hoping to save his head and his neck, to side with the revolutionaries, and he gave himself the name of Philippe Égalité, which in French means... how would you translate that, Annie, actually?
Equality?
Philip Equality, I guess.
Equality Philip.
Yes. His name was... Imagine his first name, Philippe, last name, Equality. But he was, in fact, Philippe d'Orléans, and he was the brother of the king, Louis XVI.
He was trying to kind of obscure the fact that he was...
It was hard to obscure,
Yeah.
But what happened was that he was someone who was a gambler, and he was someone who spent a fortune. He spent so much money that he wound up literally being broke. And this is the brother of the king, okay? This is right before the revolution. This is in the 1770s and 1780s.
See,
and
it happens in every
It happens in every age. I mean, this is even without credit cards, So what happened was this, because this is this mansion, this palace with this huge piece of land was something that he had taken over. He decided that in order to recuperate some of his debt, that he would have to do a commercial venture. Well, you know even better than I do that the royals are not supposed to have anything to do with commerce. I mean, it's dirtying your hands to do commerce. But what he did was something incredibly interesting. He hired some of the best architects, and he took this piece of land that was used as a park by Richelieu and this magnificent palace, and he had them not completely destroy it, but convert it so that he made the park into an open square, and he had them build galleries, the covered galleries with arches all the way around the square, and decided to convert part of the palace into structures that could be shops.
I see.
For the aristocrats, for the upper class. So
even back then, these were shops.
That's right.
Oh.
And so what happened was he basically opened it. He was literally the first speculator, if you want, for construction. And so what he did, he was a developer, and he created what is literally, it's in exactly the same form today. That is the Palais Royal, which has these magnificent arcades and covered galleries all the way around it. And still, on one side is residential, on the other side has shops, which of course are very, very upper class shops. And the official royal theater, the Comédie Française, is adjoining to this.
Oh.
So what happened was, when he did this, and this is remember, this is really for the upper crust of Paris. This is certainly not for the poor people or even the just sort of lower middle class type people. It was a huge success. Why? Because he was creating a space with elegance that was covered so that people, especially the ladies, could be protected from the rain, from the cold, from all of the terrible things out there in the weather,
Well, when we first started this podcast, I thought I should make a crack about bad Parisian weather, but I thought, oh no, don't do that. But you're doing it.
Well, I mean, winter in Paris is pretty nasty in general.
Yeah.
And it was a huge, huge, huge success. So what happens? We move on. We are entering into the period where we have the revolution. Philippe Égalité winds up going away.
Name.
Philippe Auguin, Philippe d'Orléans. Well, you know, don't laugh, because now the part of the French royal family that still pretends to have rights to the throne are his descendants. You see, because his brother Louis XVI, he got his. He was guillotined, and his children all died, and so in fact it moved over to the brother's side and
To Mr. Equality.
To Mr. Equality. His descendants now, who I assume would be like great whatever grandchildren. They don't use Equality. They use d'Orléans. This is the family of there is still a Prince d'Orléans somewhere out there.
Yeah. But if my name was d'Orléans, I think I'd use it too.
Exactly.
Yeah. I think forget the equality business.
So let's get back to the covered passageways.
Yeah, sorry.
So anyway, so what happened was that he inspired other very entrepreneurial, wealthy people. Mm-hmm. And very soon after that, in the 1790s, other people bought up land. If you can imagine, there was the Louvre, and then there was this stretch of land, and then behind it, which is really just going a little bit north, in part of what is now the very dense area of the center of Paris, it was still open. Some of it was open land. A lot of it was built up. There were mansions, there were palaces and everything. There was a little bit of open land, but there was a lot that was actually simply already developed.
Yeah.
And so several people decided to take the inspiration from what they saw with the Palais Royal and do something that was similar, but with a very interesting architectural twist. And so the very first ones, that is in the 1790s, 1795, and a little bit later, what they did was they went, and I can't give you the names of, I'm going to give you the name of one person actually, but the several people who started this idea, they took two magnificent mansions. Imagine these magnificent mansions that were built sometimes in the 1700s. And they decided that what they wanted to do was create a covered street. Basically, first idea was a covered street. In other words, Paris was known for not being clean. It was mud and muck and filth in many of the streets.
So even then, they didn't have cobblestone
Absolutely
or anything?
not.
Okay.
They had nothing.
It was still mud.
And it was still mud. And it was very difficult. You could travel around by carriage. But if you had to get out and walk somewhere, even for ladies, I mean,
that's awful.
It was awful.
Yeah.
And so it was very interesting because I don't know if Paris was really the very first place in all of Europe to do this. But what they did was, so several of these speculators bought a piece of land between two of these beautiful mansions, and they decided that it would become private property, and they didn't close it off completely. What they did was they covered it. They covered it so that there was a roof. But now these are attached to maybe two mansions that have 2 or 3 floors up.
Yeah,
so
the
idea was the roof was very high. And from the very beginning, they did something that was very unusual and very expensive. They decided to put glass in the roof.
So that the light would come through.
So that there would be natural light. And the idea was to create a commercial space that was protected from the elements and that could be closed off at night or whenever, because it is in fact a private space.
I'm surprised Macy's didn't move right in.
Well, they would have, except of course that Macy's didn't exist at the time. Otherwise, I'm sure they would have. So what happened was they offered space to various people to buy up, in terms of the shop space inside. And little by little, starting in the 1790s, various different speculators bought up pieces of land, and they did one of two things. They either covered what was basically a lane, a very narrow lane, in between two buildings, or they created something themselves by raising old medieval buildings, building structures around them, and then creating these passageways. And they go, the shortest one, if I'm not mistaken, because they're in three different sections of Paris. The shortest one is about 45 meters long, which is not very long.
Yeah, no.
But the longest one is 190 meters long.
Yeah,
that's very big.
Yeah.
And in fact, it goes, it makes an L shape. It goes down what would be the equivalent of one very big city block and hooks around on a perpendicular angle. and comes around on another side. And little by little, starting from the very, very first ones, they were a huge commercial success.
Yeah.
Very, very big. And it inspired architects and it inspired decorators so that they started doing magnificent mosaic floors or beautiful tiled floors with gorgeous designs. And they started inventing new ways of creating these covered ceilings, some of them that are pointed and some of them that are actually rounded, and a few of them that actually have rotundas, that have domes with magnificent metalwork, stonework, and glasswork. And the very first ones were 2 or 3 of them right behind where the Palais Royal was. And believe it or not, they still exist.
Wow.
Now, altogether, the covered passages were built between 1790 and 1860.
Okay.
In a period of just about 70 years.
Yeah.
They say that at the height of the time when this was fashionable, there were over 150 of them in Paris.
That's a lot.
They were a huge success.
Yeah.
They were designed at first almost exclusively to be for well-off customers. And they were designed to be magnificent on the inside. And little by little, they moved out to an area that's, well, I'll just mention at the end, but that's that is certainly not very nice now, and it wasn't even that nice back then. But believe it or not, between the passageways that were covered, that were actually lanes that existed already, and the speculators who bought up land and then built from scratch the buildings and the passageways, what happened was that it was so much of a success that they were emulated in major cities all over Europe. And it was the thing to go and see in Paris in the middle of the 1800s.
That's cool.
The passageways that were sometimes called passage, and sometimes called galerie.
Yeah, yeah.
And there were many different types. What happened was that we have General Haussmann. Now, we've mentioned General Haussmann before. General Haussmann was a man who was responsible for opening up and modernizing a good part of Paris. This is under Louis Philippe. And one of the things that Haussmann...
So hang on. I'm going to show off my historical knowledge here. Louis Philippe was the last French king, right?
Right.
See, I know
Good for you.
I learned something.
Good for you. He was also another one who could have called himself Egality, but didn't bother, I mean, he was cool. He was apparently...
He didn't have to.
He didn't have to.
Right.
He didn't have to.
If you have to change your name to Equality, there's something wrong with you.
There's something wrong with you.
I mean, that is just not right.
Yeah, but, I would still have liked to have some of his money, even if he was called Philippe Equality, But what happened was that Haussmann, who was given a huge task, a very serious task, which was... it was based on 2 things. He was asked to open up and modernize Paris, which had stayed largely a very medieval, tightly, densely packed city with lots of very filthy streets and very little drainage for running off things and everything. But also, there was another reason for doing this. With all of the turmoil of the various things from the revolution in 1789 on, there was a decision made that was a political decision, and that was to create big, wide boulevards and avenues so that people could not hide and do urban guerrilla warfare.
Oh.
And that is one of the principal reasons for the creation of all of the big boulevards, the Place de l'Étoile and everything, all of the big wide streets.
It's wide open, yeah.
Keep it wide open. The army can walk down it. There's less chance of ambush. It opens it up to light. So it wasn't just for aesthetic purposes, and it wasn't just for creating a healthier environment, which is, of course, now we see that as part of what happened in the middle of the 1800s. And so what happened was that some of the areas where some of these passageways or covered galleries were built were raised in order to build these big, wide boulevards.
Oh, I see.
And one of the things...
a lot of things were probably raised at that time.
Yes, a lot of things were raised.
Yeah,
I mean, that's why when you go to the dead center of old Paris, which is, of course, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically. And 6 a little bit. Remember, we're talking about it's like a snail, right?
Yeah.
It's a snail. It works out. Those are the old medieval parts that have a few wide streets. Whereas if you get to the second ring around and then the third, it's almost exclusively big wide streets and then some little pockets of old little narrow streets because all of that was basically redone by housemen. And so what happened was a whole lot of these covered passages were destroyed, and in their place there were boulevards that were established, and several of these boulevards followed the lines of the old ramparts on the northern side of old Paris, and those are what are now called the Grands Boulevards. The Grand Boulevard, which basically starts at, you have Boulevard Haussmann, you have Boulevard Montmartre, Boulevard Poissonnière.
What? The third one, the Poissonnière?
Poissonnière.
Like fish.
Like fish, yes.
Okay.
Boulevard de Bonne Nouvelle.
Yeah.
Boulevard Saint-Denis.
Okay.
Going as far almost as Boulevard Saint-Martin.
Bonne Nouvelle is good news.
Good news.
Good news Boulevard.
And what happened was,
I'd like to live on that one.
These boulevards, which are now what are called by anybody who is a Parisian, les Grands Boulevards, that's what they're called. In the place of these covered passages or passageways that were known for being the best places to go shopping, whether it's for clothing, for books, for anything at all. This is mercantile Paris, right? In their place were established the first and the very first anywhere in the world department stores. And so Galeries Lafayette basically was built right there on the Grand Boulevard, right next to what were a whole series of these covered passageways. And so one replaced the other. And the idea, of course, is that it was a really new idea. It's very interesting from a commercial point of view. In the past, anywhere, and not just in Paris, not just in France, there have always been shops. As long as there have been cities and human beings, there have been shops, and there have been places where people go to buy things and sell things. But apparently, the idea of having these covered passageways that had a specific kind, a certain quality of shop, where you had a whole series of them, one right after the other, where the street or basically the floor you walked on was really clean, it was well lighted, it was protected from the elements. And on top of that, there were stairs that took you to the floor above the stores, and those were elegant apartments.
Yeah.
So it was a new idea. And the people who were the first ones to open what basically are department stores, which was Galeries Lafayette and the Printemps and the Good Samaritan, Le Samaritain, they took the idea of what they could see in the passageways and said, what if we take this idea, put it in a big structure, we have stairs going up several floors, and we include everything. And there we get the idea of basically the big department store where you have for men, for women, for this and that. And of course, in its concept, the covered passages really, really resemble on a miniature level commercial fancy malls today.
Yeah.
Because some of them had just stores, but almost always had at least one very chic cafe. Some of them had stores plus restaurants. Some of them had stores plus restaurants plus theaters.
So is that where the name Galeries Lafayette, the Galerie, is it because that was another name for the covered passages?
It's because they took the name of, because remember, if you start building in 1860, which was the last year that a covered passageway was finished, actually I believe it was 1859, but the next year, a lot of these started being demolished, but there were still many in existence.
Of course.
So in order to attract people to this new thing, which is now this department store, which is on a big wide street instead of these narrow little passageways, obviously, if you use the word gallery, what you're talking about is associating one with the other.
Right.
And the idea also, I think, was that a gallery was considered to be, at that time, something chic. Because the idea was to create chic. Now, in the past, there were, as I said, at the height of this period of the covered passageways, there were over 150. Right now, in Paris, in terms of what is in decent condition that you can actually go see and walk through, there are 17.
Okay.
Okay?
Well, that's quite a few.
There are enough to be able to really do a nice visit.
Yeah.
And they are basically...
You probably couldn't get to all of them in a day, could you?
You can, but when I was
But
just
why?
in Paris
I mean,
when was I there? A few weeks ago, I decided I wanted to go and see the covered ones. I could have done it if I'd kept up all day long and started early enough in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
But I already knew a bunch of them that I really liked, and I decided that I wanted to go to the part of the city where they're the ones that are the most run down right now. And I wanted to see what they were like and if there was anything really worthwhile seeing there in terms of the architecture.
Yeah.
So it's not necessary. It's not necessary to see them all. I'm going to mention a few of them because they're famous, because they're very beautiful, and because of some of the kinds of stores that there are inside them. And I'm just going to give an idea and mention the 3 neighborhoods that the different passageways are in, because I think it's really interesting. Some of them, as I mentioned, real Parisians go to them all the time. And the ones that the Parisians actually go to the most, that is real Parisians, not tourists, are the ones that are indeed close to the department stores. And there are several that are left, and there are 3 in a row. One of them is this one that is very much the oldest one, called the Passage Panorama.
Okay.
It's from 1799.
Mm-hmm.
Then next to it is one called the Passage Jouffroy. Jouffroy.
Spell that.
Jouffroy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very strange.
Jouffroy. So
Jouffroy.
it's the.
Isn't that somebody's name? I think.
Yeah, it's like the equivalent of Jeffrey in English.
Right, and all of these passageways, by the way, except for the one that's called the Panorama, are named after the people who paid for them. These were the developers.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so we're talking commercial ideas that exist to this day.
Yeah.
The Galerie Jouffroy was Mr. Jouffroy.
Mm-hmm.
The one next to it is named after a man named Verre d'eau, not verre d'eau as in a glass of water, but that's a joke. We'll just have to. We'll have to explain that one.
Glass of water.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But how do you spell his name?
Verdeau.
Okay.
And they are the people who paid for this land. And then, of course, people who wanted to buy the shops would buy the shops and lease the shops from them. Yeah. But they are, to this day, private property. And interestingly enough, I was looking this up because I have 2 books at home about them because I found this so really fascinating. But also I was looking up a website yesterday. They close. I mean, except for one of them that stays open till midnight. They all close around 8 or 9 at night, even though there are shops and restaurants inside them. And that's it. It's like going into a gated community once the doors close, and they open at 6 or 7 in the morning. And they're all still, to this day, private property. So there's these 3. There's the Passage de Panorama. It is, in fact, the oldest one.
Yeah.
It is one of the first ones to use a metallic frame and glass for a ceiling. And it's famous now for having frame shops and stamp shops and old bookstores. And it's very, very beautiful inside. And it has a few restaurants. If you go across the boulevard, you go into the Jouffroy, which is one of my favorite ones. It's in an L shape. It has a very strange thing because at some point there are 2-3 steps where you have to go down to go around the corner. I love it. It has a lot of bookstores, beautiful old books and new books. It has jewelry stores. You know, that's one of my weaknesses. It is the first one to have an entire metallic and glass structure, which, of course, is a time in Paris when they started doing magnificent things in metallic structure and glass, like the Grand Palais and the marketplaces. And the Jouffroy is actually quite a bit later. It's from 1847. And it also has, believe it or not, 1847 now, heated floors.
Heated floors?
Heated floors.
Wow.
Well, now, you know, the Romans had heated floors. It's just that we have forgotten for over 1,500 years how the Romans made those heated floors. But they did indeed have heated floors. And here we are in the middle of the 19th century.
I hear they're bad for varicose veins.
Well, they apparently are. But if you walk around this one, believe me, you come out of a cold winter day in Paris. Yeah. It's a wonderful, wonderful passageway. It has a wonderful salon de thé. It has all kinds of great shops. And it takes you out on the other side, and you get to the third one, which is shorter, and this is the one that's called the Passage Verdot, and that is also from the middle of the 1840s. And all three are very close to something that we haven't talked about, but is actually a lot of fun. Some people like to go to it. I personally don't, but I'll mention it anyway. At the entrance or the exit, if you want, of the Passage Jouffroy, which is on Boulevard Montmartre, you have the Musée Grévin.
Yeah. Okay.
And the Musée Grévin, for those people out there who don't know it, is the wax museum. It's like Madame Cousteau's wax museum in London. Yeah. And it happens that Mr. Grévin was the other man who was one of the developers for this passageway. And then eventually he started out by making effigies of famous people at the time as a way of bringing people into the passageways. And that somehow gave them the idea of creating effigies of well-known people, which led to eventually the creation of the wax museum. And all of these passageways have two exits or entrances by definition. And so I came into the Passage Jouffroy from the back end, which is because I walked from where the Galerie Lafayette was. And lo and behold, spent hours going in and out of these shops looking at this marvelous thing with the glass and the metallic ceiling. And it came out the other way, and I was in front of a crowd waiting to get into the Musée Grévin.
Uh-huh. But the shops, are they like independent stores, or is it going to be like Zara? And
No.
Okay.
They're all independent
They're not
stores.
Chains.
No, absolutely not at all. And again, now these three are the Passage Panorama is largely restaurants now. It has some shops, but it's largely restaurants. Jouffroy is a lot of bookstores, a lot of interesting other kinds of shops. Those are the three that are very close, within a few blocks of the area on the Grand Boulevard where the department stores are. Mm-hmm. So if you're going to visit Galerie Lafayette or Printemps, the big department stores, it's really a few blocks away. You can actually walk over and see these, and they're very, very interesting.
And what type of shopper would want to, the restaurants I understand, and the bookstores too.
People who like... Okay, let me back up a little bit, because one of the other area where there are many is still the area behind the Palais Royal.
Okay.
And this is where you will see there are three. One of them is called the Galerie Vivienne, and one is called the Galerie Véro d'Oda. These are the names of the people who actually paid to have them built. These are very close to the Palais Royal. These have mosaic floors, rotunded ceilings, magnificent ceilings, paintings on the walls and on the ceilings. They are absolutely exquisite. In those that are close to the Palais Royal, it's all luxurious shops. It's antique shops, jewelry stores, collectors' books. There are three like that there. One of them has been turned into the passageway that belongs to the National Institute of Art History. So you can actually go in and browse in their library in there. And I have pictures in my book, and maybe we'll find some and we'll put up on the website. They are magnificent. They are like going inside a palace. And these all have the metallic and glass structure, but with two of them have rotundas, to make sure that people understand how magnificent and elaborate and luxurious they are.
So what comes to my mind, it's very funny, because I'm thinking of, because you can't see this obviously, but Elise is holding a book, and I can see the cover of the book, and it's one of the covered passageways. And to me, it looks like one of those on the big cruise ships, like the Royal Caribbean cruise ships. You have the promenade. It's all covered. It's like an indoor street with shopping on the side.
And if you notice in this one, which I'm not even sure which one we're looking at here, but I think it's one of these three that I just mentioned.
Maybe I'll put a reference.
Notice that you have a walkway up above on the top floor,
Yes.
and these are apartments with plants because, of course, you have all this natural light.
Yeah.
And then, of course, all of these apartments have openings with real light and air on the outside going in, and it's really quite beautiful. But to answer, it is in that sense this kind of thing. You have around the Palais Royal to this day, the passageways or the galleries that are left are luxurious. To answer your question, they were conceived of for doing what is called in French flâner.
Oh.
To stroll around.
Yeah.
To stroll around, window shop, and be seen, because after all, this is the upper class. So what kind of shoppers go there? Well, people like me who love to window shop, people who like to look into different stores, bookstores, jewelry stores, clothing stores. In fact, the 3 passageways near the Palais Royal, if you are interested in seeing what luxurious shopping is when it comes to things like furniture, books, jewelry, antiques. Obviously, it doesn't matter. You can go in. It's not like you're going into a place where you have to buy anything.
No.
It's just absolutely beautiful. The second area, the one I just mentioned, near the Grand Boulevard, it's not so fancy. It's nice. They're beautiful, but it's not so fancy. And there, I actually bought something as a present for my mom. Me and my mom and jewelry. I got a beautiful art book in one of the stores. They have lovely bookstores. And, of course, that's something that you find a lot in Paris. And a tea shop. I mean, there's everything you can possibly want. So they're really fun places to visit. It's just like walking up and down a street in a neighborhood.
Yeah. Are there some that are kind of in disrepair and where the shopping isn't so trendy and so forth?
Yes.
And the grungy ones.
There are a couple... And it's kind of sad because, in fact, the area where there are still the most is in an area that's close to the Boulevard Saint-Denis. And the Boulevard Saint-Denis is, there's still one of the 2 ancient doorways into Paris, and that one of them is right there on Boulevard Saint-Denis. It's right near a metro stop called Strasbourg-Sébastopol. And there's also another metro stop, which is Réaumur-Sébastopol.
Yeah.
If you go from this doorway, which is the Saint-Denis doorway, and you go down the Boulevard Sébastopol, which is a boulevard that basically was cut through by housemen and runs pretty much north-south. It takes you eventually to the Seine River. You will find a whole group of them. And this is the ones that I went to explore when I was back in Paris just a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
And there, unfortunately, you have several that are very much in disrepair. There are 1 or 2 that are not even conducive to even walking into and looking around. And then you have a few, strangely enough, and one of them is called the Galerie Caire, named after Cairo, the city in Egypt.
Yes. So
which has this very...
C-A-I-R-E.
C-A-I-R-E. It has this fun, fake Egyptian sculpture at the entranceways, and when you walk in and out, it's kind of nice. And the glasswork and the metallic work on the ceiling is really, really beautiful. But the stores are really relatively run down. And so they don't have the cachet that they had before, but some of them are really interesting to walk through. And then there is one, and let's see if I can figure out if I can give you the name of that one, because there are so many of them, actually. But there is one... and that is called the Brady Passage, named after, interestingly enough, that a man who was an American trader who came to Paris in the 1850s, and it even had public baths inside it. And now I walked through that one, and it's a very long one. It's maybe the longest. It's 216 meters long. It is entirely used by people who are from India and Pakistan. And they sell clothing and spices and food, And when you walk through, it has this absolutely beautiful covering up on top. It had a rotunda which was amputated when they cut through one of the big boulevards. But it smells like going to India or Pakistan inside, you know.
Wow.
And apparently everybody in Paris knows that if you want to get all of these things that come from those countries and very exotic, you know, spices and things like that, that this is the one to go to.
That's cool.
There's one that actually belongs to the National Library, and that is the Gallery Colbert, which is in the second arrondissement, so it's not too far from Saint-Denis, and it is the property actually of the National Public Library, but you can go in, and it houses a building that has things about national heritage and things like that. So some of them, and many of them, have been renovated. The ones around Saint-Denis are basically the ones that have not been renovated too much. But there are, in fact, a couple of them that are really interesting. And one of them, as I mentioned, is the one that's called the Passage du Caire. And it has these fake sphinxes on the outside. And then there's another one, which is really kind of interesting. And that is called the Passage du Grand Cerf, which means surf, which means deer. And that...
Is it C-E-R-F?
C-E-R-F.
Okay.
And that's this one that you can see here.
Okay, that's the one in the picture I can see.
And it's really beautiful.
Sorry, listeners.
And you can see this on the inside.
Yeah.
And this one, interestingly enough, is in that area. It's in between Rue Saint-Denis and the Place de la République. And it has these magnificent apartments on the upper part. And you can see the struts. But what I think is really, there's a one called the Passage des Princes, which is lovely. Look at this one. It's just beautiful. It's just all this gorgeous work. Now, one of the things that happened with these is that it was these covered passages that inspired the architects to do things like the Grand Palais.
Yes.
And to do the magnificent work. Later on at another podcast, we can talk about the work of a man named Baltard, who created all these magnificent covered marketplaces in Paris. All of this was inspired by the work in glass and metallic structure that first started with these passageways. So they also are what gave Eiffel, without the glass, of course, but with the metallic structure, the idea for even being able to build something like the Eiffel Tower. So it was the innovation in using, of course, there was cast iron, which was invented in France.
Yeah.
Before that, it would have been impossible to have a metallic structure like that. But you have here this combination of architectural innovation and at the same time a real commercial entrepreneurial spirit that allowed for these passageways and galleries to be built, and people came from as far away as Russia to see them. They were really very, very, very famous. So it's really worth going to see just two or three of them.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's nicer to see some of the ones that are still in very pretty condition. And many of them became national historical monuments in the 1970s, a few of them later on. Several of them have been renovated so that they are in excellent condition again. And a few in the area around Saint-Denis are not in very good condition. And there is one, and I can't remember if I can find the name of it, but it's one of the ones in the Saint-Denis area. You can go inside it. Structurally, it's not that interesting. It's all wholesalers of clothing now. So it's in the edge of the garment district, which just butts up against the area of Boulevard Saint-Denis. And so it was very interesting because I walked in, and as you know, since that's what I am, is like I like to do shopping, if nothing else, just window shopping. I walked into one of the stores, and a woman there said, no, this is only for wholesalers. But interestingly enough, as I turned around to go out, another person came in and asked the same question. So obviously it's not very clear whether or not. Now, there were a few that were close, that were still on what is now the Grand Boulevard, that were a little further east, that have been destroyed, that were known for housing theaters. And in French, there is an expression called Théâtre du Boulevard.
That's right.
Which means a lighthearted, more or less comic theater.
Yeah.
And that's where the expression comes from.
Oh.
Because these were the theaters which would have been kind of a little bit like maybe cafe theater or vaudeville theater.
Yeah,
It's still
yeah.
used today, Théâtre du Boulevard. And it usually means things that are not the tragedies and the great classics and things
Right.
like that. And that is the reason why they were called that, because the first theaters that were built for them were in these passageways.
Interesting. Interesting.
So isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
So there are a whole bunch of them left to see. Unfortunately, many, of course, were destroyed. Many were destroyed in the 1800s, and then there were a bunch that were destroyed in the course of the 20th century as well. But you have basically three clusters. You have behind the Palais Royal, you have close to the Grand Boulevard where the department stores are, and then you have this other group that is actually fairly big, but doesn't have the fanciest ones, that is starting at the gateway of Saint-Denis and working your way down. And they're very, very interesting things to see. And it's another side and aspect of Paris to discover.
Right, right. Yeah, and that's particularly good if you've been to Paris several times and you want something new to experience. That sounds really good.
So just to remind people again, so you have three areas. You have around the Palais Royal. You have near the Grand Boulevard, which means really starting from behind the Opera Garnier, close to there. It's a little bit further, a few blocks away. And the third area is around Saint-Denis. And you have several that have antiques, and some that have restaurants, and some that have...
Do you know which ones have antiques?
Yes, it's the Véro d'Auda and the Galerie Vivienne, which are the two close to the Palais Royal.
Okay.
And the ones that are really specialized, at least one of them specializes in books, is Jouffroy. Mm-hmm. And another one that's very beautiful, it's Passage Choiseul, which is one that had two...
Probably Choiseul. Okay.
And that was the one that had theater and cabaret, and writers would come and poets would come and recite things. And in that one, which still stands, which was built early, it was built in 1825, the theater actually got turned into a bank. That's the way things go, isn't it? But I highly recommend doing this as a new way of discovering aspects of Paris.
Yeah, I think it's perfect, especially for people who like to shop. I mean, you know, if it's not my thing.
It's not your thing.
But I think I would find it from just the pictures I'm looking at, and I'll try to find a bunch for the podcast page. So you'll find that on joinusinfrance.com/29. Yeah, I'll try and find a bunch of pictures. I think I would have fun taking pictures.
Yeah, I think you would too. And they're very beautiful. And now remember, they were designed for people to saunter and look in the shops, to have natural light, and to be protected from the elements. And they were really designed so that there was shops down below and then apartments up above. So, and the structure of them, some of them is absolutely beautiful with the glass and the metallic structure. And some of them have magnificent mosaics on the floor or beautiful tiles in different patterns. There's something really to be discovered.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you, Elise.
You're welcome.
That's great. Next time I'm in Paris, I'll have to go see if I can find one or two of those.
Well, I'm going to be back up there in a couple of weeks, and I can't wait now to go check out, you know me, I'm going to go to the fancy ones behind the Palais Royal. I can't buy anything, but at least I can pretend, you know.
I think they won't even let me in.
Oh, come on.
With my flip-flops. They'll be like, woman, get out of here.
Oh, well, you know, July and August in Paris, they let anybody in because the Parisians have all left, so it doesn't matter anyway.
Well, and you never know who's got the money.
And you never know.
I have to say, my daughter and I went into Hermès once. I can't remember where this was, but it was obviously a very chic area. And I decided I just wanted to walk in just to see. And everybody was charming. Now, after we left, we were both wearing shorts and tank tops and flip-flops and not looking very nice at all. But somebody opened the door. Bonjour, madame. Bonjour, mademoiselle. Every person we looked at said bonjour. was very, obsequious.
Obsequious, yeah.
Almost.
I think they were supposed to be, actually.
Right, but in a friendly way. And we looked around the store and bought nothing, because what am I going to want from Hermes, personally? But we asked...
The wings, maybe?
Maybe the wings.
Maybe the wings, right.
We looked at this very nice... What intrigued me was this big coffre. So it was like a travel chest, an old-style travel chest. And it looked really nice. And they opened it for us and showed us and explained how it worked and what it was for. And I thought it was very nice of them. So these kinds of places, sometimes you're surprised.
You are surprised.
They're very nice to you, even if you're not dressed nicely.
Well, it is true. You never know who has money.
Exactly. So, all right, listeners, thank you very much. Be nice to us and share the podcast with people you know who are going to France. For some reason, I think Paris is going to get a lot of visitors in September, because a lot of people who write to us
say they're all going in September.
Right, they're all going in September. So I'm like, wow, it's going to get slammed with people.
It's gonna get slammed, right.
No, but it's good. It's a good thing. All right, thank you. We will talk to you next Saturday.
See you next week.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.